Thank you, Abdul. Hi, I am Muhammad Kamran Janjua, and I'll be talking about the rest of the paper. Just to recap a bit, the authors try to relate the time series data from EEG to the intermediate states of the language processing models. They want to understand what sort of information needs to be represented inside the intermediate states and eventually how can it relate to the human brain. The first and foremost thing to consider is the methodology or the method that allows the quantification and the processing complexity of the sentence. This quantification is done via something known as the complexity metrics, and there are several of them that the authors discuss in this paper. Generally speaking, a complexity metric is something that quantifies how difficult it is to perceive a linguistic expression. This characterization includes any rule that relates parsing mechanisms to word-by-word measures of comprehension difficulty. In typical psycholinguistic modeling practice, one computes the value of the metric at each word partition in a given stimulus sentence. These predictions are then compared with observed measures of the comprehension effort, such as reading time, scalp potentials, or blood oxygen level in particular brain areas. If the per word information values match up well with the observed measures, then we say that the observed data supports the conjunction of the complexity metric and the probabilities defined by some language model. There are four complexity metrics that are considered by the authors to quantify the complexity of processing sentences, since they allow the relation between the computational models and the measured human response. When this quantification or processing is done incrementally, these complexity metrics are incremental complexity metrics. The first and foremost, and perhaps the most basic, is something called distance. Distance refers to the number of parser actions explored between each word, so the number of processing steps the beam search takes for a given word before moving on after realizing that word is the distance metric. In other words, how many actions had to be taken to synchronize KNLCs at the next word. That is, until there were enough lexical actions. Just to recap a bit on lexical actions are a generation of word, and the other actions are called structural actions, which are opening or closing a sentence, phrase, etc., since they relate to the structure of the sentence. This is an example of the distance, since, as I've told before, that this distance refers to the number of parser actions explored between each word, and they vary by word. The next metric that the authors talk about is called surprisal. Surprisal is the log ratio of summed forward probabilities of analyses in the beam. That is the log conditional probabilities of a word. So if a word is less probable to occur, then the event is unlikely, the event of the word occurring. And therefore, we call that word more surprising because eventually more information is required to represent that. Therefore, the surprisal metric is computed over the word beam. The third metric that the authors talk about is entropy. Entropy is average uncertainty of analyses in the beam. This is a bit similar to surprisal, with a difference that in addition to the log ratio of forward probabilities of surprisal, the probability of word is also multiplied by that. And the last metric that the authors consider is entropy delta, which is the difference between current and previous entropy value. All of these quantify the word by word processing difficulty of the parsing algorithms. To summarize, complexity metrics serve as a linking rule between computational models and human responses that are measured from EEG in this case. The link between theories of parsing and grammar to potentially observable measurements, such as reading times and neural signals, which is EEG potentials in this case, is realized via these matrices. The next that I want to talk about is dataset. EEG is a technique that measures very small voltage fluctuations in the scalp. The authors analyzed data from 33 participants who wore the EEG cap, like the one shown in the picture, and the stimuli that they heard was from an audiobook, Alice's Adventures in the Wonderland. The participants listened to the first 8 chapters of the book via earphones in an isolated booth. The participants then took an 8 question comprehension quiz. This was done in order to make sure that the participants were had actually uh, understood the content that they were hearing, and to also to make sure that comprehension was tested. The authors report that all the participants on that 8 question test scored above chance. The data was recorded at 500 hertz from 61 electrodes, like the ones on the EEG cap, and some basic pre-processing was done, such as the removal of any noisy data or ocular artifacts. Well, there are several language models that we'll talk about in a bit, but the authors argue that all of the language models were trained on Alice's Adventures in the Wonderland, chapters 2 to 12, which comprised a total of 24,941 words. The audiobook that the participants heard was from the chapter 1, which had around 2,169 words. During the training, the first chapter was used as a development set, and to evaluate the intrinsic performance of the model, RNNG for example, perplexity metric was considered. Perplexity metric is just a quantification of how well the model is performing without regards to any given specific task. So it's an intrinsic evaluation metric. Let's talk briefly about various different models that are used by the authors. Uh, there are actually 3 different models that the authors use in their experiments. All the models are trained on the same amount of textual data, but they do differ in how they represent the syntactic information. The baseline model, which is not shown in here, is a vanilla LSTM model. The LSTM model treats sentence as a sequence of words and build no explicit phrase structure hierarchy. The main model is the RNNG model, which was explained by my friend Abdul. To compare if the relation is in fact related to syntax, a degraded version of RNNG called RNNG comp, which is shown at the left hand side, is also considered. In RNNG comp, the explicit composition function is missing. So as you can see that the sentence, the rabbit hole, and with the starting and closing noun phrase is not composed into one single vector, other than all the words are individually passed to the layers of the model, and eventually a syntactic context is built. Compare that with the RNNG. You can see that the hungry cat is composed to a noun phrase at a stack, and then the syntactic context is built. So, for example, in RNNG, the sentence "the hungry cat" is represented by a single vector due to the composition of hungry cat to a noun phrase, like I said. So if we were to compare the phrase "the hungry cat," it would be represented in the RNG comp by 5 different symbols: the starting of the noun phrase, the hungry cat, and then eventually the closing of the noun phrase, instead of just being represented by one composed vector. For LSTM, for LSTM model, surprisal was used as a baseline, whereas distance surprisal entropy from RNNG was used to compare the results. Now let's jump right into experiments, the different types of experiments that the authors conduct. The method to relate the parser states to EEG data is a simple linear regression. The neural signal, which is EEG voltage in this case, is predicted from the parser states via the complexity matrix. This allows to explore the suitability of RNNG and beam search combination as a cognitive model of language processing difficulty. The linear regression was used per participant at each time and electrode, since the information when the words happened in time and also the location of those in the EEG signal is known. For example, given this audio stimulus, Alice opened the door and found it led into a small. You have the gray boxes in the EEG that match the occurrence of the word. So all of them were composed to form a matrix for each word, electrode, and time, and which became the eventual Y because the goal of the prediction was to predict the EEG voltage at each electrode. And so word by word processing complexity metrics formed in a matrix of some sort, as shown in the upper right hand corner in the picture, is the input that is fed to the linear regression model and is regressed against the voltage. In the baseline model, the LSTM1, some additional control predictors were also included, which are known to influence sentence processing. They are position index of the word, which is word order in a sentence, the sentence order, the log word frequency, unigram frequency of the word, the next word, and also the previous word, and also the acoustic sound power of the speaker, because the authors didn't want to model those things. Additionally, since the temporal autocorrelation across subjects, time points, and electrodes could impact the model fits, therefore null regression models were also constructed in which the input matrix was randomly permuted. This was done to make sure that if there was any effect by autocorrelation, it would be removed. The regression coefficient from each were tested against the null regressor models across all the electrodes. Now let's talk about the results of these experiments. Before moving on to discussing several experiments and their results that the authors have conducted, I would like to summarize the findings of the paper briefly. There are two patterns in the EEG data that were observed by the authors. The first is the early effect of surprisal from the parser, Beam Search K200. This is an early effect since this occurs close to the onset of the word. The other is the distance effect that occurs much later from the onset, almost 600 milliseconds from the onset of the word. This corresponds to the P600 signal. To recap a bit, like Abdul explained, the P600 is a signature signal of the human syntactical processing. The authors observed that the P600 signal in response to naturalistic text from an audiobook, Alice's Adventures in the Wonderland in this case. This suggests that RNNG is tracking syntactic processing. So this was the main finding of the paper, as these two effects that the authors observe. The diagrams given on the left-hand side show that the distance occurred a bit late from the onset, which is at 0 in the x-axis, and there's beta coefficient on the y-axis from the regression model. And you can see that the effect by distance, which is localized in the center of the brain, occurred at around 600 milliseconds, whereas the effect from the surprisal was observed early on, and also which was very close to the onset, and the effect is entirely localized in the frontal area of the brain. So there are several other experiments that the authors perform. In the RNG model, in addition to surprisal and distance, entropy and entropy delta were also used. Entropy derived similar effects as surprisal, early, and frontal, like it's shown in the picture, but it was negative going. The authors did not visualize the results, rather just presented the quantitative findings. Whereas entropy delta's effects localized to the right side of the brain, and the visual results of this were also not shown in the paper. Additionally, the authors conduct experiments on surprisal from LSTM and show that they did not reliably predict EEG amplitude at any time point or electrode. I already talked about how there is no explicit phase structure composition in LSTM, and therefore the authors attribute that this could be one of the reasons uh, of why LSTM with surprisal did not reliably predict EEG amplitude. Of course, there might be some implicit composition of the phase structure happening within LSTM, but authors argue that they do not help whatever they are in reliable prediction of the EEG amplitude. The comparison between RNNG and RNNG comp, which is the degraded counterpart, was done in three main regions of the brain: uh, ANT, ANT400, and P600. These regions are defined by a selection of electrodes and a time window whose 0 point corresponds to the onset of spoken word in the naturalistic speech stimulus. The N400 is the event-related brain potential and peaks at about 400 milliseconds, which is between 300 to 500 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. The P600, as described previously, includes posterior electrodes somewhere 600 milliseconds to 700 milliseconds post onset. And ANT consists of anterior electrodes around 200 milliseconds to 400 milliseconds onset. And it's also visible from the picture on the left hand side that ANT is localized towards the frontal area of the brain, and 400 is somewhere in the middle, and P600 is at the back side of the head. The authors wanted to examine if individual target predictors from RNNG significantly improved over the RNNG comp model, and if RNNG comp improved over the baseline, that is, surprisal from LSTM, plus some control predictors such as the word frequency, acoustic sound power, unigram frequency, etc. The targets are 8 reliable effects. So, just to talk a bit about the K value in this diagram, it's the size of the beam search, which is equal to 200. And since the authors vary this and experiment with different complexity metrics. So there are 8 reliable effects. Surprisal at K beam search size 100, and then surprisal and distance at beam search size 200, 400, and an entropy delta at beam size 400, distance and entropy at beam size 600. So these are 8 experiments, 8 different reliable effects. Since there are 3 regions in the brain that the authors are considering, and 400, P600, and ANT, so a total of 24 experiments were conducted, 8 effects by 3 regions. Let's talk a bit about the results of these. In the N400 region, no statistically significant results were found. However, distance from RNNG comp in P600 and surprisal for RNNG in ANT region were found to be statistically significant. Authors say that the absence of N400 effect could be attributed to the choice of electrodes or the modality of the stimulus. For example, using audiobook instead of reading, which could also be one of the critiques on the work, that instead of opting for the reading, and the authors opted for the audiobook. But the authors have argued that since not all languages are literary, uh, using audiobooks as the stimulus is a more naturalistic way. The earlier peak is the one derived by RNNG under surprisal only when the explicit composition mechanism is included. So remember, the composition mechanism is the composing of sentence into an explicit syntax structure, noun phrase in this example, before passing it to the model. Okay. So the results on the left hand side in the table are the likelihood ratio tests The results show that regression models with predictors derived from RNNGs, the ones with syntactic composition, do a better job in the RNNG comp, which is their degraded counterparts, when accounting for an early peak in ant, as you can see on the table on the right hand side. Also, it's important to note that although the p-value, the acceptance value, is 0.05, but since there are 24 experiments for 8 effects across 3 areas, and they divide that by 24 to apply something called the Bonferroni correction. However, coming back to the experiments, however, RNNG comp do improve over the LSTM baseline in accounting for P600 peak, as it's visible in the left side of the columns in the table. So to summarize, RNNG comp is better than the baseline LSTM model, which is better than the which is not better than the RNNG model, which has explicit composition. So it's like baseline model, then RNNG comp, and then the RNNG, which is the best because it has explicit composition. The results suggest a pattern to the approach. The complexity metrics serve to interpret the unified model at different places or times within the brain. Uh, Cognitively plausible models are mechanistic computation models that do same task people do in the course of ordinary language comprehension. EEG is an important tool in neurolinguistics because of very high time resolution. It records voltage fluctuations on the scalp of the brain. The goal of this paper was to relate the time series data from EEG to the intermediate states of the language processing models in hopes of examining what sort of information needs to be represented inside the intermediate states. The authors found that if structure is explicitly represented inside the models, like in the case of RNNG, which is recurrent neural network grammar, then reliably they can predict patterns in the EEG data. However, if there is no sentence structure, or if it is zapped specifically, like they did in the RNNG comp counterpart of RNNG, then no such predictive structure is obtained. To conclude, neural recurrent grammars (RNNGs) do learn something about the natural language syntax, and what they learn corresponds to the indices of human language processing difficulty as gauged by the EEG. This work has shown that RNNG plus beam search procedure yields quantitative predictions about language comprehension difficulty. Since the authors say that this the experiments that they perform and the setting that they have established to study such effects is a broader scope and is not limited. Therefore, the road is now open for more fine-grained investigations and timing of individual parsing operations within the human sentence processing mechanisms. Thank you.